Welcome to Yahoo Finance. I'm Kristen Myers, and this is 2020, a time for change. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Beder Ginsburg's passing has ignited a political firestorm. Republicans have promised that the president's nominee will get a vote on the Senate floor. And if that happens, one of the people casting a vote will be New Jersey Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, one of only 2 Senate members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. He says he's more concerned than ever about what's at stake with a more conservative Supreme Court and its disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities. Take a listen to our conversation.
What's at stake is the reality that for millions of Americans, including a disproportionate number of Latinos and African Americans who ultimately achieved health care for the first time, health care coverage for the first time under the Affordable Care Act, that Affordable Care Act is presently before the Supreme Court and at stake of being struck down. If it's struck down, my Republican colleagues who have had for more than a decade the opportunity to have their own plan out there have nothing. So millions in the midst of a pandemic where Latinos and African Americans have been disproportionately affected in both illnesses and deaths will have no health care coverage. They will have no pre-existing conditions protections, which the Affordable Care Act provided. They will have no coverage for the uniqueness of some of the minority health realities that we face. Women will no longer have a choice over their personal health decisions. And civil rights, voting rights, immigrant rights are all at stake. So that's what's at stake, not just in this Supreme Court nominee, but that's what's at stake in this election.
Are you concerned just more broadly about, or actually, I should say more specifically, about this particular election, that this election could potentially be in the hands of the Supreme Court if there is a challenge?
Well, it worries me deeply, as it should disturb every American, that the president said that, in fact, we need to get the Supreme Court justice on the court because they will decide the election. In this democracy, I thought the people decide the election, not the Supreme Court. And so when that is your mentality, that somehow you're going to create the environment in which you're going to throw it into the courts so that your court that you've helped pack ultimately decides the election in your favor, that is a subversion of our democracy and everything that we have fought for since the inception of the Republic.
Now, Senator, I know you were talking just a moment ago about healthcare, which is obviously the huge topic of the day around the coronavirus pandemic. You have proposed a commission on coronavirus styled much like the 9/11 Commission. You've called it a bipartisan effort. And I wanted to ask about that particularly, because at least when the 9/11 Commission came around, 9/11 was a huge point of unity for everyone in this country. However, this pandemic has been highly politicized and a point of division. I'm curious to know if you're concerned at all, or how much faith and hope you have in the bipartisan effort moving forward of this commission and any bipartisan initiatives and solutions that could come out of a commission based on something so divisive.
Well, our proposal for a national coronavirus commission, very similar to a 9/11 commission, starts off with bipartisan and bicameral support. We have a Republican colleague, Susan Collins, has joined me in the Senate. A Republican and a Democrat have introduced the legislation in the House. We have received a large universe of former Homeland Security and other officials of both parties that have endorsed the legislation. The commission itself will have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats that get appointed. So what the commission is to take a look back and a look forward to understand what went right, what went wrong, what the federal government did right and wrong, what the states did right and wrong, what we need to do in the future in the face of a pandemic or an epidemic. And this is critical for us to be able to learn from this tragic set of circumstances we've had with the pandemic and not to repeat the mistakes for the future.
So to that point about preparing for the future, I know that your commission is also going to be focusing on the disproportionate impact that the virus has had on Black and Hispanic communities. And Hispanic households have obviously very severely felt the impacts of this pandemic. I'm wondering if there's a thought here or even a hope after this commission wraps up and concludes its findings to create some sort of legislation that is going to be targeted in the future to help those struggling communities. As we know, this pandemic did not create disparities, but rather revealed them. Is there a hope or a goal from this commission to essentially help those Hispanic communities better access, for example, healthcare in the future?
Well, it's a great question. And let me start off by saying we're not going to wait for the commission. For some things that we see now is a reality in the disparity in healthcare and in some cases the discrimination as it relates to Black and Hispanic Americans. We do believe that the commission, because of the nature of it, will have an opportunity for further recommendations in the future as to how we deal with these disparities. I mean, look, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on communities of color. The sad fact is, if you're Black or brown in America, you're more likely to be infected by the coronavirus than if you're white. You're also, unfortunately and tragically, more likely to die as a result. Latinos have a 2.8 times higher rate than white Americans. Hospitalizations are 4.6 times higher. The death rate is 1.1 times higher. And so in many states, actually, the rates of infection and death among Latinos and African Americans outpace their share of the population in that state. So these are just the tragic realities. But when we look at underlying health issues, comorbidities, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, or some within our communities, we understand that we need not wait for the commission to deal with that, but we look forward to the commission having a universal and complementary set of recommendations for the future.
So to that point then, Senator, you were obviously just listing some statistics there from the CDC. Case counts for Hispanics 2.8 times higher than whites. I believe you mentioned that death rate 1.1 times higher than white folks in the country. So then what can Congress do right now to essentially improve the health outcomes of this virus for Hispanic and Black households in the country?
Well, for one, as someone who's one of the authors of the Affordable Care Act as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, we need to build upon that. We have to create greater access for communities of color. We have to deal with some of the underlying, health issues that these communities have. We also have to recognize the fact that for both African Americans and Latinos, they're more likely to be essential frontline workers, meaning higher exposure to the virus. As a result of that, they're doing some of the toughest work, so all of us can stay home or all of us can safely distance. We should be making sure that in the workplace for these particular workers, considering the underlying health conditions that they have, that there are further protections. Those are all things that Congress can be doing right now.
I want to ask you now about stimulus. It's, of course, stalled in Congress, and you yourself called the Republican stimulus package a, quote, sham plan. As Congress continues partisan bickering over a plan, whether it's going to be 2.2 trillion, 3 trillion, et cetera, we are continuing to see millions of Americans suffer, millions of Americans still on unemployment. So I guess the question is, when can Americans expect some sort of economic relief, and how much are Democrats willing to give by way of concessions to get folks something?
Well, let me just start off by saying it may seem to some as partisan bickering, but if Democrats had not stood up when we were comprising and composing the CARES Act, that's $600 that people got extra in unemployment and extended unemployment benefits and gig workers included on unemployment would not have existed. Now, some people may have considered that partisan bickering. I consider it one of the most significant things that we had for people not to go ultimately in desperate economic straits. If it wasn't for our engagement, the PPP program would not have extended to really, truly small businesses, women and minority-owned businesses. But as a result of our effort, it did. So, yes, we're not looking for the perfect, even though we believe a larger number is appropriate. But even President Trump recently embraced 1.5 trillion. However, when 20 Republican senators tell Leader McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, that they will vote for nothing, as you just asked by your question, obviously something is necessary. So when they're unwilling to vote for nothing, that's a big, big difference in both sides. So yes, we are willing to compromise. We are willing to nearly come into half of the figure that we thought was necessary, but we need Republicans to meet us. And as part of that, we need to help states and local governments that are at the front line of helping our communities, which right now are facing a huge, huge problem.
Of course, that was, again, Democratic Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey. Well, coming up after a quick break, we will be chatting with National Urban League President Marc Morial.
Welcome back to 2020, A Time for Change. I'm Sabine Marcellus. President Trump plans to announce his Supreme Court pick on Saturday. That means that it'll be a race against the clock for Senate Republicans who want to get a conservative judge on the Supreme Court by Election Day. So what impact will that have on the country's judicial system? Joining us now is Marc Morial. He's the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Marc, are you worried about having a conservative woman on the Supreme Court? And what impact do you think that would have on the country's legal system?
Well, there's no doubt, and thank you for having me on Yahoo Finance. There's no doubt that to add another conservative to the Supreme Court could unalterably, for the foreseeable future, affect the direction of the court. The court's relatively been balanced between, it's been 5-4 conservative, but you've had Justice Kennedy and now Justice Roberts sort of sitting in the middle of the court, serving as a swing vote from time to time on many important cases. I'm concerned that so much is at risk. Healthcare is at risk. A woman's right to choose is at risk. The fate of the Voting Rights Act is at risk with an alteration of the court. But what I'm also concerned about is just the outright hypocrisy we see from the Senate majority. 4 years ago, they were absolutely rigid and unyielding in standing on principle to say we cannot confirm a Supreme Court justice in the year of an election. Let's let the voters decide. Now they've reversed course on a principle and a precedent they established, which means that the American people are being violated. The sense of integrity, the sense of consistency is being violated because now there's a rush to not only fill a seat in the year of an election, but to fill a seat with almost 30 days to go before the end of voting. People are voting now. The election is underway now. So it's an act of hypocrisy. And I think it's also an effort to hijack the direction of the court, which is deeply offensive to me and something that we have got to resist. My hope is that there are enough Republican senators who stand on that principle and say, we're not going to violate that principle. We're not going to violate the precedent we set 4 years ago for political expediency.
Marc, from the death of George Floyd to the shooting of Jacob Blake, what role do you think Supreme Court justices can have in terms of helping us achieve change when it comes to issues such as police brutality? And do you think President Trump's nominee could help with that?
Well, certainly a justice who's going to be, cases relative to police misconduct and brutality rarely get to the Supreme Court. But I can tell you many civil rights issues and voting rights issues and affirmative action issues do get to the Supreme Court. Less than 10 years ago, and people have talked about Shelby v. Holder. To me, Shelby v. Holder is one of the tragic decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. I think it will be remembered the way the Dred Scott decision is remembered. The way the Plessy v. Ferguson decision is remembered, that they tortured the logic, they misconstrued the Constitution, and they did it all in the name of political power, not in the name of applying the law to the facts, or applying the Constitution to the facts. So I think a Supreme Court could be extremely, potentially highly influential with respect to this. But Supreme Courts also set tones in the country, the way presidents set tones, the way Congress, meaning the House and the Senate, set tones as to whether they're going to be on the side of due process, on the side of protection of rights. This is what makes the Warren Court, the court in the 1950s and the 1960s, which really continued to affect the nation into the 70s and the 80s, so influential. They stood up. They shaped jurisprudence to meet the needs of the times. And in many respects, by doing so, they held the country together.
So, Marc, I saw a really interesting cartoon that likened the Democrats and the Republicans to Charlie Brown in the football and Lucy, with Lucy constantly, as we all know, pulling the football out from underneath Charlie Brown, which would in this case be the Democrats. But we're already now in a situation, as you mentioned, the election some 6 weeks away. For the American people and for activists like yourself, organizations like the National Urban League, what do we do now, today, on September 24th, September 25th, October 10th, in the run-up to the election, when the Senate decides, hey, we're going to move ahead with that Supreme Court nominee? What can we, the people, do? Or do we just have to sit back and say, listen, this is going to be a lesson for us in the future. This is a lesson for Democrats in the future.
We have to vote for change. I mean, people have to be willing to say, if you like the direction of the country, if you're better off today than you were 4 years ago, maybe you vote for the status quo. If you are, and I say this in my personal capacity, right? If you are worse off today, and if you believe the country is in the wrong direction, then your option is to vote for change in a significant and meaningful way. What I hope people do is turn out in record numbers. The most powerful thing would be a record voter turnout across the board so that the voice of the people can be heard in this election. But I think we have to call out the hypocrisy, the absolute hypocrisy of the Senate majority, who just seem to be hell-bent to manipulate the rules to grab power. In a democracy, it's the rule of law. In the Senate, precedent is often observed. It's not as though the precedent was forced on them. They set the precedent. Go look at Lindsey Graham's words. Use my words against me. He said, we're setting a precedent here. We need to understand. And very conveniently and quickly, without any deliberation, he switches course and says, I'll vote for whatever the president wants.
Well, Marc, we're definitely going to keep an eye out on that and see what happens if the Senate Republicans try to push through President Trump's nominee before the election. But Marc, Morial, we don't want you to go anywhere because we want to continue this conversation after this quick break.
Welcome back to Yahoo Finance's A Time for Change 2020. We are talking with National Urban League President Marc Morial. And Marc, you were just talking about wanting to have a huge turnout. And I want to get to how you think that's going to happen and if you're optimistic, just because of all the doubts that the president has been seeding over how this election is going to actually pan out. And even on the other side of it, in terms of a transfer of power, do you feel like that will suppress the vote?
Well, I don't believe it will. I think what it does is it builds in more resentment and more of a determination to vote. And I think it's an act of trickery and deception and psychological warfare to try to undermine and literally insult the intelligence of the people by questioning the integrity of the voting process. Because you don't like the potential outcome of the voting process, you undermine. Donald Trump did this in 2016. When he was behind in the polls in early October, he raised questions about the integrity of the process. This is an old movie. This is what we call in the neighborhood a wolf ticket, an empty threat, a hollow suggestion. I'm going to resist the transfer of power. These are hollow, empty threats. And I hope people don't take them seriously. But I also hope, as they do to me, as a person, as an American, as someone who's seen members of their family who could not vote fight to secure the right to vote, it's deeply insulting to suggest that somehow the Postal Service is not an organization of integrity. It's deeply disturbing to suggest that somehow there's something wrong with the elections process. And I think the American people are smart enough, intelligent enough, and insightful enough not to fall for sort of these empty schoolyard threats that seem to emanate day to day. So I'm encouraging people, be vigilant and absolutely pay attention, but don't fall for empty threats. Don't fall for hollow suggestions. Right now, you've got an ecosystem working to try to discredit the election. One of the main players in this effort is Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation, who've embarked on a consistent campaign going all the way back to 2013 and 2014 to suppress African American voters, to create racial division in the country, to play games on the internet. And I think people need to be woke and aware and very offended by it and say, you know what, we're going to stand up for our democracy. Stand up for your democracy. Don't be tricked. Don't be intimidated. Don't be fooled, because that is what the objective is: to trick, to intimidate, and to fool you so somehow you don't go out to vote. You don't believe your vote counts. You believe that the elections process. Now, I bet you that there's a different message going on Donald Trump's social media pages. And I don't think it's about don't vote. I think it's all about trying to get people to vote, trying to get his base to vote. So I'm just saying to people, look, I've been in this game for a little while, and I've seen some of these movies of deception and psychological games being played. It's just being played now from the largest bully pulpit that exists in the world, and that's the presidency of the United States.
Marc, before we let you go, just tell us really briefly about the effort for the community conversation and concert event happening tomorrow. Is one of the goals to help small businesses?
Yes. I mean, we are working to help small businesses all the time, and that's going to be one of its focuses.
All right. Well, we'll have to bring you back, Marc. We always love having you on.
Again. Want everybody to follow us at Nat Urban League, at Marc Morial. Be part of this ongoing conversation. And I just encourage people to vote, vote, and vote.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to talk to you before the November 3rd election. Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
And that is our show. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to tune in next week at this time, 4:30 p.m. for our next episode of 2020, A Time for Change.